Welcome to Guided Conversations, highlighting experiences of intersectionality in the profession. Sponsored by the ABA Commission on Women in the Profession and the Civil Rights and Social Justice section. To receive CLE credit, you must attend the entire program. Partial credit is not available. Please click on all participation verification alerts to confirm your attendance. After the program ends, a link to complete the certification process will appear. Please complete the evaluation and the CLE affidavit, providing your bar information as requested, and submit. Once your attendance is verified, your certificate will be emailed to you. Moderating the program today is Michele Coleman Mays. Michele is former Vice President, General Counsel, and Secretary at the New York Public Library. Michele, you may proceed with the program.
Thank you so much. I am delighted to be able to moderate this conversation this afternoon. We've got a fabulous lineup of very accomplished and talented women, and I'm going to only briefly introduce them, since if I did a longer introduction, we'd be here until 4, just with the introductions. I'll begin with Kim Chainey. Kim's not on camera yet, but we're working on that. She is Executive Vice President and Global General Counsel of Aptar Group, Inc. Next, it's Professor Angelique EagleWoman. She is Chief Justice, Sisseton Wahpeton Supreme Court, and also Director, Native American Law and Sovereignty Institute, Mitchell Hamline School of Law. Yvette Ostolaza, she is at Sidley Austin LLP. She's the Management Committee Chair and Executive Committee member. And finally, we have Heather Russell, Executive Vice President and Chief Legal Officer, TransUnion. So I've asked all the panelists to begin by explaining why they felt compelled or voluntold to be on the panel this afternoon, and I'll begin with Heather.
Thanks, Michele. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm happy to be here today. Thanks. I was asked to participate by the chairwoman of the Chicago Network, which is an organization of C-suite executives in the Chicago area. She asked me to participate because I'm an outspoken advocate for diversity and inclusion and equality in the legal profession, and I'm happy to be here today.
Great. Yvette?
Thank you for inviting me. I was thrilled to be invited. I think these types of panels are very important in terms of making sure we take our profession to the next level. And in particular, as the first woman chair of a top 7 revenue firm in the United States, and also the first Hispanic, male or female, to do a top 20 firm, I always think it's important to have that perspective of what has succeeded and what has not so much in the industry in terms of big law.
Thank you, Yvette. Angelique?
Good afternoon. I wanted to be part of this panel to share perspectives from Native American women. One of our esteemed Native American women law deans asked me to join the panel. I'm happy to be here, collaborate, and see how we can contribute to discussions among all women. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelique. We are still having trouble getting Kim connected, so we'll start the questions, and it's perfect because, Angelique, I actually asked you to begin the dialogue about this issue in the study that says it's best if you have trust established before jumping into a topic like this about the relationship between women of color and white women. And you had a very interesting reaction when I asked you about trust. Why don't you share that this afternoon?
Sure. So as Native women, we are members of tribal governments that have been in relationships with the United States since before the United States was formed. And so we've had sort of a yo-yo relationship with the United States, where at times our governments are supported, and at other times the United States has taken on policies to destroy our tribal governments, to take our land, and even take our children. And so when we talk about trust, there can be a lot of distrust for Native women. We also are often the only person. I'd like to bring up, there is an ABA study called Excluded and Alone about Native American women's experiences in the law. And so we often have to defend our culture, our tribal nations, our lands, even our existence at times, and not be seen as excluded, left out, or invisible. So yes, there can be trust issues.
And so Angelique, how do you overcome that then? If you look at the history, and I think many of us know why distrust would be a natural reaction, particularly as a professor, when you're trying to educate so many different types of students, how have you bridged that distrust with needing to establish a rapport and to be able to talk about topics that may not be comfortable for everybody?
Well, as an educator, that is what I see as meaningful in my life, is to enlighten people on the existence of tribal nations, let them know about the accomplishments in the legal profession and other professions for Native people, and to help change the narrative around who Native people are and how we also share very common values with every other person, including as women, caring about family, community. We're dual citizens of the US and with our tribal nations, so we do care about the health of the US as well. So there are many ways to bridge those gaps between people's knowledge and who we are. And I think many of us often spend a lot of time, and it can be very exhausting, educating. But for me, it's my main work.
So you mentioned to me that being part of your tribe is very important. Why don't you tell the audience what your tribe is?
Thank you. So my name is Angelique EagleWoman, Wambadio Anwi Chake Washtewiya in my Dakota language. I'm Sistemwakten Oyate, the Lake Traverse Reservation, and that's one of the Dakota tribes. So for the Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and we're part of the Ocheti Shakowee, the 7 council fires that really are our Aboriginal land is the middle of what we would now call the United States.
And now you know why I didn't attempt to repeat what you just said. I would have butchered it. So Kim is still, and you know what I was going to suggest to the operator, if Kim is having trouble being on camera, is it possible for her to dial in? Because I was actually going to her for the next question, and I'm not sure what would be easiest for us to do.
And Michele, I am on. Thanks for the magic of technology. If you can hear me, I am available to take a crack at this second question.
Well, I'm going to let you take that crack because you approach the question of trust and having this conversation very differently from Angelique. So what's your approach when you start looking at having trust among people when they're having these difficult conversations, or at least, as I said, the conversations are not necessarily happy ones? What's your approach, Kim?
Absolutely. I'm a big believer in trusting, giving everyone the benefit of the doubt. So I lead with trust. And the reason why I lead with trust is in the course of my career, I have learned that if you trust people, you will immediately establish relationships with people who are trustworthy. You will also find out very quickly who is not trustworthy because they usually they will be true to who they are. And they'll betray your trust pretty quickly. It's better to do it on small things than it is to do it when you're really dependent on folks on big stuff. So if you start with trust, you build trusting relationships quickly, you build a reputation for trust. And that's always where I start. Some people call it a spirit of positive intent. Others say, if you show me who you are, I believe you. It's all around that same principle. Let's get through the fluff early. Let's get to who we really are. And if I trust 15 people and 3 of them are inherently trustworthy right up front, those are 3 people I can keep for life. So I always start with a spirit of trust. I start with a spirit of positive intent. You can't see this, but I'm an African-American woman from the South, which may not be what you expected to hear. But for me, that spirit of positive intent and trust is something that it gets you through the fluff fairly quickly.
So Kim, I'm curious, when did you adopt this philosophy that you give people the benefit of the doubt and assume that they're going to be trustworthy and therefore their intent is well-meaning, versus assuming just the opposite, which is that you're out to get me because you think less of me because I'm a woman of color?
I think a good question. The way I would describe it, it probably comes from my upbringing as a person of faith, so it was probably built there. And if you can believe it, it was reinforced in a class that I took in business school. So I'm a JD MBA from Wharton, and there's a class that's required called strategy. And the game theory is that the only thing that works, the only game theory that works long term for businesses and for people is something called tit for tat. Is I trust you, you trust me, and then we develop more trust. So it was very interesting to see some of the most sophisticated business leaders, some of the most sophisticated strategists walk me through something that I knew intrinsically was helpful as a long-term game theory. The second part of that is sometimes when people are not trustworthy, you will occasionally have to try again. Not all the time, maybe once or twice, to see if they will change their behavior. But that's how I got my reinforcement. I learned it at home, and then I learned it again at school.
That's an interesting development. I was going to ask you, have you been burned by that philosophy, but I'll leave that for another day. So I want to move to the next question, and I'm going to start. So, okay, so wait a minute, then I'm going back. So tell me when you've been burned and you've still given the person a second chance. Because I'm going back to your remark where you said that if people show you who they are, believe them.
Correct. Occasionally, I do get burned. I hope somebody has changed their stripes, and they don't, and I get burned again. But what I've also seen is cases where I've had, clients where they were less than trustworthy. But over time, they realized that I was in it for the company and for people. We had a common goal, and they changed their behavior over time. So it does happen occasionally.
Okay. It's funny because you're the second person. Angelique also talked about finding common ground. And I would tell you that it absolutely is the goal of this conversation and others like it, that at the end of the day, people are carving out common ground rather than only talking about how I'm so different from you. And Yvette, I would even go back to, because you talked about being a unicorn in so many ways. And so let me go to the next question with you. The study states that all women of color are not the same, and therefore it is ill-advised to group all women of color into the same bucket when speaking about gender bias. It recommends increasing cultural competency, which is something dear to Angelique. So why do you think the study makes this recommendation to recognize that bias shows up in different ways? And I'm going to ask Angelique to talk about cultural competency because that's very dear to her heart. But let me start with you about women of color not experiencing gender bias the same way.
Well, thank you so much for that. And I also want to comment just briefly on positive intent because I'm a big believer in that too. I think it's so exhausting, and I'm using Angelique's word of sometimes it's exhausting to have to be all things for all people. But if you have positive intent, I think not only if you get burned later, other folks and other people that you work with see your leadership style of one that giving people the benefit of the doubt, but it also takes a lot less energy to be a positive intent person than carry around paranoia and not looking at different perspectives, because often there are a lot of misunderstandings, both culturally and in terms of gender, where people have perspectives that were ingrained from their childhood, from their geography and background. And I could give a million examples of that, that as you get to know the people, really at the end of the day, it wasn't the same reasons that they had a different view. There are people out there that are bad, and there are people that you shouldn't give positive intent to. But I would say generally in our profession, as we're working with people, focusing on education and on positive intent is much better and much more rewarding than the other way. But going back to this issue of treating everybody differently based on who they are, I'm surprised they had to put that on a study. Isn't it obvious that you shouldn't group everybody together? I thought it was kind of a silly comment. It was like, oh, gee, everybody is not the same that's in a gender. Really? Can't believe that had to be put in writing. And, you know, some women have more in common with the men that they work with. Some have more in common with the women. But I will say that discrimination against certain types of people is more pervasive than others. And the reality of that, anytime somebody tries to say everybody's in the same background, I think is silly. And sometimes it's dependent on where you live, you know, and the particular biases that they have. And so for me, one of the things that I talked about being a unicorn is that I actually found that my language skills and that being Hispanic had generally been a more positive thing for me than being a woman. And the reason I say that is because I grew up in Florida and then I moved to Texas. And so having the language skills, having the connections with clients that were international was actually one of my superpowers in terms of pitching clients, retaining people, or in recruiting, or in being in front of certain judges where maybe I had more commonality. And so, but I think, you know, I used to say the last form of discrimination that was allowed to say out loud and was really about being a woman. You know, often you could see people saying even 10 years ago, oh, you know, I would prefer to have a man in my case, or maybe she doesn't sign this pleading, or is she really going to be a jury trial lawyer or not? And, you know, I could give examples that would make you cringe, where if you substituted woman for other categories like a religion or an ethnic background, people would never do that. And so that's where I see my experience being a little bit different than that. And it's just, that's part of the geography. Where I grew up, where people were the majority, where the language skills made a difference. So I often found that people were discriminated if they didn't speak 2 languages in my community. It was like, really? They only speak 1 language? Or they don't have a passport? I mean, it was like, ugh, you know, who are you? You don't have a passport? Because most of the people I dealt with, you know, were immigrants, spoke multiple languages, they were conglomerates. And so that perspective was a positive for me. I think it was much more difficult growing up in big law. And obviously I am where I am now. So some people might say, well, was it really that difficult? But it was way more challenging being a woman for a variety of reasons than my background.
So Yvette, let me interrupt you 1 second. Your comment at the beginning of your remarks that you found it almost a waste of time to ask the question about, are there differences between women of color? Of course there are differences. And yet what I would share with you, which is one of the things that prompted the study, was when I floated the idea, now this is back several years ago when I chaired the Commission on Women, I would ask white women, well, have you thought about whether there are differences in how people experience gender bias? And the response that I got from more than one sophisticated, and I use that term consciously, sophisticated practicing lawyer, female, was, well, it's gender bias. Why am I also looking at things beyond gender? And I just nodded my head and I said, that's proof in the pudding. The fact that people won't even acknowledge that there can be differences when you have intersectionality. And when I talk about intersectionality, just so we're all on the same page, I'm talking about overlapping systems of discrimination that affect people in profound ways. And so to come back to your observation, it wasn't universally the reaction of that study is not worth doing. And if anything, it prompted me to push it through.
No, and Michele, I think you're right, and the world has changed, but I think that multiple layers of differences, depending on where you're from, can hurt you more. I mean, people tend to be, you know, like people that are like them, or that they feel comfortable with, or that they grew up with.
I know.
And if you have more and more differences that don't match, you know, the name of saying people are tribal, they like the people that they know, can impact you. And I think there's certainly a pecking order of how we have perceived discrimination. And it really varies, you know, for those of us that have global environments that we deal with. You go to places in Europe and the discrimination of where they focus on, who they put down, can be very different.
I agree.
Sometimes it can be based on religion. And so to me, I think it is definitely worth asking the question. I just found the answer profoundly surprising that anybody would question that, because, there are so many differences between men. And so why would, we not think the same thing with respect to women? And that's what I found funny.
So let me go to Ann.
Yeah.
And I understand that, but it seems so obvious to you that it was an unnecessary topic to probe. But Angelique, I want to go to this cultural competency question, and also the remark that Yvette made about people being tribal, especially since we talked about your damn tribe. So tell me how you kind of mix all that together and where you come out.
That's a teachable moment, and that's something I was going to talk about. For Native women, there are basic comments that are often shared where there's a lack of cultural competency or understanding what the term may mean to a tribal person. And so what often happens is the Native person then withdraws, becomes isolated, and leaves. And so that's one way to get us out of systems and jobs and environments, is to use these terms that are positive to us in a derogatory way. I wrote a whole law review article about this. It came out in June 2023, if you want to read it. It's called Capitalization of Tribal Nations, the Decolonization of Nomenclature and Citation in the United States. But we do hear people using terms, hold down the fort, circle the wagons around them. People are tribals and negative. Let's have a powwow. I could go on and on and on. So for cultural competency, for Native people, we're very different. There are 574 tribal nations in the US. Almost half are Alaskan Native governments. I bet many people didn't know that. Yet we have many common world values and world views. And we also encourage people to learn about us from us. So we've been very studied. There's been a lot of non-Native anthropologists, commentators. And so we ask that you read Native authors on Native topics. Subscribe to a tribal newspaper. There are all kinds of ways to become culturally competent. And I also sit as the chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee at our law school. And we invite all of our affinity group leaders to come in and share and talk to each other. And these are the ways that we develop cultural competency, by interaction and by having teachable moments.
So do you think, and I want to go to Heather after this because I want to get her reaction, because I'm...
Sorry, one comment on that, because I think it's very valid. And in fact, it was used for that reason, in the sense that if you look at the studies with respect to the whole issue of how anthropologists view the world, and that's the nod that I was giving to when you look at diversity and integration and all that, it was that nod, not an derogatory, the completely teachable, of how the anthropologists look at human behavior from a woman's standpoint or whatever. But point taken, and a good comment, that to the extent that is viewed as a negative, I actually view it as a positive reality of how you can retain and recruit people by success breeding success, and having more people that have similar backgrounds. And then when everything is all taken care of, you have a better way of people making sure that they have trust versus being by themselves in the collective sense. So anyhow, but good point.
So Angelique, when you talk about folks using terms that they never, even if you look at the sports teams, right? When they had names that people were like, we've had this for decades. Why would they have to change it now? This is somebody being too politically correct. So how often have you run into that comment? Please, you've got a thin skin, Angelique. Give us a break.
Well, we're actually talking about things that happen in my everyday life. There was a study in 2015 of young adults who are Native American, and it found that 98% had daily microaggressions. A microaggression is when you hear something negative about who you are, or a misstatement about who you are, or a mockery of who you are. And we have frozen in time imagery. We have people that allow or buy their children Halloween costumes to dress up like us. We have mascots in public schools and professional teams. So all of these things harm our people and our youth especially. And when that harms our youth, we often see mental health issues, right? We see substance abuse issues. And then when that's not treated, we see suicide. So all of these things have impacts. And that's one of the reasons why I'm an educator, is because I want to make the world better for my people and for the people coming after me. So it is difficult to deal with. Microaggressions happen a lot for Native people. And as an educator, I'm thankful I have the tools to be able to respond and bring in teachings, whereas a lot of Native people may not have that sense, again, withdraw, isolate, and leave.
Right. Heather, let me ask you, because you, when I spoke with you a couple days ago, we talked about you have a lot of women of color on your staff. And how have you kind of incorporated the fact that there are differences, not enough to say that you can't find common ground, but there are differences. So how have you navigated that as a general counsel? Because you don't want to be accused of what some people would say is favoritism versus acknowledging differences, because there is a difference among those terms.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. I have a legal risk and compliance team of about 360 people across 33 countries. So there's a lot of work that we do consistently to ensure that we have cultural sensitivities, right? I'm also across TransUnion, I'm the sponsor of our Gender Equity Steering Committee, where we made a very public pledge that we were going to have parity in leadership at the company by 2030. Now, when we signed this pledge in 2019, that seemed, well, of course we're going to have gender parity by 2030. Seems a bit of a pipe dream at this point. I'm also the executive sponsor for Women at TransUnion, and I created our, the legal risk and compliance team's own diversity, inclusion, and belonging team. So I am a bit of the token woman on the leadership team of the company. And have been very public around the importance of equality and diversity and inclusion. Having said that, I have to really watch how I message these goals and intents of mine, depending on, excuse me, depending on who I'm speaking with. We have thousands of people in India, and the culture in India is very different. The role of women in the Indian culture is very different. And so where I would provide a rousing speech to my female colleagues in America, it needs to be much more sensitive to the cultural expectations of women in India, or be it Colombia or the Philippines or what have you. To your point, Michele, about avoiding favoritisms, it's something I think about all the time, because I've got a 77% diverse workforce reporting into me. And, and that's diversity in all different forms. So that means about 23% of my team are white men. And they are, each one of them, more extraordinary than the next and very valuable people. And so it's a careful balance that you have to strike by encouraging diversity, while at the same, diversity from every single type of perspective. Because if you have a group of people who in and of themselves represent minorities or, ethnic groups, that group isn't diverse, right? It's the diversity of all of the different voices at different tables that put companies in stronger positions, because they've got different perspectives being brought to bear in those decisions. I hope that's responsive.
I'm going to turn to Kim in a minute, but one of the things that I think you and Yvette have in common is that because of the positions you hold as, leader of the firm and also the general counsel for a multinational company, how do you acknowledge differences without being accused of marginalizing white males, for example? I don't envy you,
Yvette,
so how do you,
Yvette,
you want to take that?
We're in a talent war. And the way that I see it is, if you want to win as an organization, both the men and women, we got to attract the best of the best, regardless of their background, their religion, where they're from. And that is how I position it, that we want to win. We want to have the most talented people. And so if one of the superpowers that our firm has is having a Heather or having an Angelique or having a Michele or having me that allows us to get that edge because people see a role model, we are fortunate to do that. And we will be more financially successful because of it. So I think everybody understands competition. Everybody understands winning. The world is diverse, and in every way, clients are diverse, judges are diverse, whatever. And the more of that thinking that you have that has different perspectives, you win. And so I always say that if there's a firm that is not doing that, I'm going to be able to compete against them and I'm going to be able to win. So I focus more on, I know that it can be viewed as, we should be do this because it's the right thing. I know what I do because it's the right thing, but at the end of the day, I run a business, and I think the business and doing the right thing are here co-centric. In the world that we live in, we can no longer, just because of a number of things, labor, workforce, competition, you cannot afford to just hire the same people all the time. And so the men that I work with, going back to the
So how many people have, Yvette, how many people have subscribed to that who are not women? If you say it's, you can't just hire the same people over and over again, because of course it's a meritocracy, so you shouldn't have to worry about that.
So anybody who says something is a pure meritocracy immediately for me loses complete respect, because they how can you really believe that? Because meritocracy is a complicated issue. And so to me, I always like to say, at the end of the day, I want to make you money, and the money is green, whether it's coming from a woman, a man, a diverse person. And that is the way that we're going to be successful. I will say, I could not be in this position if white men had not supported me. I suspect all of you in some point in your life had somebody that was a sponsor or mentor. Somebody has to be the first. And if you were just, like I said, I heard Condoleezza Rice saying, if all you rely on is on the people that have made it to be a role model, you were in trouble, at least in my age group. I hope that that's different. But I have found that many men subscribe to this and want it to succeed. With that said, we know there's a power shift and a power paradigm, and sometimes it is a zero-sum game. And so you want to make sure that you're being fair while accomplishing the goals that are the best for your organization. And so I think it's a needle you have to thread. It obviously went the other way. I mean, we know where the Supreme Court is now and the decisions that are being made. And the key thing is you always see concerns when there's economic downturns that people feel like they're that it's a zero-sum game for them. And so to me, the more that you focused, especially in the hiring process and in the retention process, of what you need to service your clients and also to attract the best talent, you're going to be okay. And everybody will understand that. I say there's not a whole lot of.
So you want to weigh in, Heather?
Yeah.
Yeah, just very briefly, I agree with that wholeheartedly. At the end of the day, diversity in all forms is good for business. And we're all, business is business and business must grow. And it is good for business to have diverse representation. And to answer your question, Michele, about, white men in particular, I think people listen to what you say, but mostly they watch what you do. And, my biggest proponents of my focus on diversity and inclusion is the white men who work near me, above me, and for me. And they watch what I model and they become evangelists themselves. And I think that's the best way to kind of, I don't want to use the word protect, but to really ensure that people know that your heart's in the right place. You're doing the right thing for the company at the end of the day, and then you're picking the right people because they're the right thing for the company. And if they happen to be men, women, non-binary, whatever the case may be, wherever they're from, you pick the right talent, business is going to do better.
Yeah, and I'll just make this observation, and I think that's a philosophy that most of us want to subscribe to, but the question that also raises is how that individual who is unique is received by the organization, because they're not going to be working with just you. They've got a whole range of people, whether it's peers, clients, other folks that are outside your institution, and that can be a rough road to hoe. It just can. But let me switch to Kim because it relates to something that Yvette was talking about, depending on where you are in the country or where you grew up or where you are globally. And Kim, the question is, do you believe women of color feel safer talking to each other rather than to white women about their experiences? That is, are they willing to be vulnerable? I'll use that word consciously here, advisedly. Are they willing to be vulnerable? Will they be seen as potentially not being able to cut it because they need a crutch? And do you think this question would vary depending on whether you're at a law firm, working for the government, a professor, or in-house?
Good question. The answer is it depends on the issue that you're discussing. I am, by way of background, I'm an M&A lawyer by background who's historically worked in manufacturing and industrials environments. Usually, up until about 5 years ago, I was the only woman in the room. Woman of color, it was just me. And so finding women who were in manufacturing or the industrials, they'd often be at different companies, very unlikely to be women of color. And so I found mentors and sponsors across the industries that I worked in. And the conversations I had with them are around common experiences. There are some topics that I will almost exclusively have with women of color or African American women because it keeps you sane, because there will just be some things that happen to you that no one else will believe unless they've had that experience happen to them. For example, as a junior associate, walking into a room to close a transaction, there being 15 people around the table, both men and women, and I was there on behalf of my firm, and I was there to finalize the deal. And they kept saying, one of the other lead attorney said, we keep waiting for my firm to show up. And the room said, well, Kim is here. It took her almost 10 minutes to realize that I was the attorney with the check to close the deal because she couldn't see me. That's not an experience that a lot of people can relate to. Whereas my colleagues who were women of color or deal lawyers, they were like, yep, happened to me too. It keeps you from going crazy. How to maneuver through corporate America, how to get promoted, how to find sponsors and mentors, that's a conversation I have with a lot of people. Both mentors, mentees, women, non-women, that's the same discussion, irrespective of gender. How we do it, the experiences we have may be different. But there are some things, I won't say I'm more comfortable, it's going to be more likely a shared experience. But other things, the goal, how we get there, tactics to use, those are usually universal.
So you mentioned in our conversation earlier that it depends on where you are in the world, which of your differences is most important. And you were looking at Europe, Asia, Brazil. Why don't you share that? Because I see amening going on from Yvette and Angelique about this whole idea of people can't believe that you really are the one in charge.
Absolutely. So when Yvette was speaking, I've been a global and international lawyer for 15 years now. I've spent more than 100 days a year on the road for the last 10 years, and most of that is outside the country, with the exception of COVID. In China and Asia, where I spent a majority or a significant portion of my career, I'm an American, just an American when I'm in Asia. When I'm in Europe, I'm a woman. And there are still rooms in Europe that I go into where there'll be 300 people in a room, 15 women max, and 5 people who are not staff. So when you walk into a room and there's 300 men and there's 5 women, it's a unique experience that I don't normally have in the U.S. In the U.S., I might be seen as a woman of color or an African-American woman, and I might have unique experiences there. And in Brazil, to have a person of color as someone who is in charge is, it's a unicorn. So it depends on where I am. It depends the cultural context that I'm walking into. I am aware of those cultural contexts. I ask. But in the end, I manage lawyers. I have to solve problems. I have to help my company. And however I get there, I go into a room with the teams that I manage, we shut the door, and we're just two lawyers trying to solve a problem. And then we walk out to our clients and we give advice based on our best assumptions and the facts that we have at that particular moment. And so I remind people my job is to walk into any country, any room, and make a connection. Sometimes it's Eagles football, go Eagles. Other times it's the fact that I went to Wharton. You know, two of my last three CEOs have been Wharton graduates. I've had conversations with people with numbers who did not speak English, and I did not speak Japanese. And we just put spreadsheets on the table, and we knew how to get to the end of a deal. You have to find the common connection. And as an African-American woman, I'm very, very creative about finding that one or two things that someone is passionate about it and talking about my passion as well. So that's how you bridge it. But I wanted to make sure that I let you know that sometimes you just need someone who's had a similar set of experiences so you can say, am I crazy? And they can reinforce the fact that, nope, that really did just happen. Got it. And you move on because the goal doesn't change.
So I have to just tell you this story, and I've shared it before, but I was dumbfounded when I first heard it several years ago, which is when you talk about differences and going with the amen section, because they say, yep, I've experienced that. You didn't lose your mind, at least not today. I was at a program in the Midwest, and one of the audience members stood up. She said, well, how would you have handled this? She said, one of my dear friends is general counsel of a Fortune 500 company. She had invited law firms to pitch business, and she was going in to meet one of the firms to hear what their wonders they were going to do for her company. As she walked in, she has her cup of coffee in her hand, and she's about to introduce herself, and one of the partners from the firm took her coffee cup as if it was for him. Well, the only thing I could say, well, do tell me they didn't get the business. Even though I know that we have the benefit of the doubt, I get it, Kim, that you say, give people, I don't know if I could have given that much doubt, but it's those types of experiences that other people look at you and go, that didn't happen. You just made that up. Angelique, what's your reaction?
Unfortunately, that does happen, and I think it still does happen. I did want to point out this study so people can see it, Excluded and Alone. This is an ABA study, and it is posted on the ABA website. And in it includes a lot of things that Native women have experienced that are very similar, being mistaken. So as a law professor, we have a whole set of books called Presumed Incompetent for Women of Color. And Miradio did a book on unequal profession for women of color law professors. And coming into a classroom with a majority white student body, we often get challenged. We're not the stereotypical image of who our law students think should be their professors. So we get pushback, we get resistance. We can have the same thing happening in faculty politics. I'm on my 5th law school at this point and love where I am. But it can be very daunting and very disrespectful. Very disrespectful. And so we often have to recover from those situations.
Yeah, you really do, because it goes back to something about, do you want to walk around with a chip on your shoulder? I think Yvette, you might have mentioned this. And at the end of the day, as one of my friends once said, if you walk around hating people, you're not killing them, you're killing yourself, because you're swallowing the hate. And it's hard to sometimes adopt that point of view. And yet when I pause and say, yeah, because they're not thinking about me, and I'm spending all my mental rental space thinking about them, it doesn't work. So Heather, I want to go to this next question for you. What was the first time that you recognized that there were differences among women, even though Yvette said it's a stupid question? Of course there are differences. But assuming for the minute that you've got all these much more junior lawyers that are earlier in career potentially, how do you let them know that you get it?
Yeah, it's a good question, and one that I honestly hadn't thought about until you suggested that we would be talking about this today. And it's one that I don't tell them that I get, because I am keenly aware that I will never be equipped to understand what it's like to be a woman of color. I am white, Irish, English, American. I am not multilingual. I am, I didn't grow up privileged, but I grew up, relatively privileged to a lot of other people. And I'm keenly aware of that. So I won't ever understand what it's like. And I can't understand the compounding effects of gender bias and racism, or gender bias and ethnic and cultural bias. But I do recognize that it's not just gender bias plus ethnic bias, but that together those biases can actually be more than the sum of their parts. And I don't have that perspective. But you asked when I kind of first recognized this, and there was a colleague of mine, a Kenyan woman, a Black woman from Kenya who was practicing law in Canada. She's a colleague that I respect immensely. And she was a public defender of a defendant in court. The defendant was a white man. And the judge, she shared the story, and I'm still so aghast at it that I'm sharing it without attribution. The judge called upon defendant's counsel to speak on behalf of the defendant. And when my colleague rose to speak, the judge told her to sit down. And because he wanted to speak to defendant's counsel. When she attempted repeatedly to explain that she was the counsel, the judge dismissed her. And so she just sat there and waited for the white male judge to recognize his mistake. He assumed that the white man who was the defendant was the lawyer, that the Black woman was the defendant. And simply because she was, Black. And that has never, something like that has never happened to me. Now, the coffee story, that's happened to me, but those are very different, different weights, right? So that type of perspective, like that's a profound experience that seems much heavier to me than just the misogynistic sexual harassment things that I think all of us have come to endure. So I don't have a good answer for that, Michele.
Yeah, but I think, Heather, just sharing the fact that you understand that there are differences, even though you cannot pretend to say, I walk in your shoes, and therefore you should give me a bunch of credit because I'm at least knowledgeable. But I give credit for knowledge. And so, when I say willful ignorance, that's what you get demerits from. People that don't want to know about indigenous people and the fact that they don't want to talk about a powwow. Like, that's not being politically correct. That's understanding a different culture. And that's willful knowledge versus willful ignorance. So I want to go to the next question because there are a couple more that I'm hoping we can get to. And this one has to do, because many of you are dealing with people who are younger in career. And I'm not talking about whether they're chronologically 50 or 20, but they're younger in career. So they don't have quite the gravitas that the folks on this panel have. They don't have all the titles. Do you think that you would have dealt differently with this when you were younger in career, trying to fight your way through the battle of becoming a general counsel or a managing partner or a law professor or a judge? Would you have handled these differences differently because you wanted to mask them rather than highlight them? And I'm going to start with Kim on this one. What would you have done as a young Kim Chainey if somebody said, well, clearly you're not the lawyer. We're waiting for the deal lawyer to show up?
I think I handle them pretty much the same. I'm a bit more tactful now as general counsel than I was as a junior associate. Those conversations are usually, well, I'm the lawyer with the check, so how do you want to handle this? Or if it's the coffee, it's well, obviously you've taken my coffee, let me go. I assume we'll hold this meeting until I get mine as well. For me, humor is a way of, and light humor is a way of deflecting. As a general counsel, as I say, I didn't change, my title did. My fashion choices changed as well, because as a general counsel, you don't wear steel-toe boots the way you do when you're a junior attorney in a manufacturing plant. But I would say my philosophy changes. As a junior person, the one thing I would say is you have to be comfortable using your voice in the room. I was recently with a junior associate or a mid-level associate who just closed a massive billion-dollar deal. And she talked about being the only woman and the only woman of color in a room of 20, and how they were deferring to the junior associate underneath her, even though she was running the deal. And I told her, yep, that's an experience that you would expect to have, and here's how you manage through it. But helping people find their voice, being comfortable speaking at the table, being comfortable listening and assessing the situation the way Yvette said, is important. So all of the folks who are who don't have the title yet, who are on the phone, it does get better, I tell you. But it is really about navigating through these spaces and making sure that you are in a room where people are comfortable hearing your voice.
So Kim,
Michele,
I agree with you that. Okay, hold on
in.
1 second, because I'm so glad you all want to chime in. So give me 1 second, and then I'll have Angelique and Yvette. Love it. One of the things I will say in observation to the story you told, I don't know if I would have said anything. I'm just going to be honest with you. When I was younger in career, I might have glared at the person, but I don't know if I would have said, I'm the one with the check, dummy. But having said that, it's good to know that you had more grit than I did when I was coming up. So Angelique, let you weigh in, and then I'll have Yvette weigh in.
I have to say, I worry about our next generation of Native women lawyers. And our law school admitted 14 Native Americans. That was probably the largest number in the United States this past fall. There are so few of us. And our Native women then go out and, make it through law school, are trying to make it into the legal profession and face so many barriers and obstacles. And so mentorship is key. And I would like to invite people listening and people part of this discussion. If there is a Native American woman in your law firm, in your office, appearing before you, that you do extend care and compassion and maybe even offer mentorship, because there are so few of us. And so, this talking to other women of color, there are other faculty members that I talk to. I'm the only Native woman on my faculty. That's very likely, if there's even one, across the 200 law schools in the United States. So it's so rare for us that often we may just freeze in those moments, not know how to handle them. And so I'm really thankful that I've had mentors along the way. But I do think it's something to, if people can keep that in mind, and then Yvette mentioned that recent U.S. Supreme Court decision that's trying to lock down what people can express in applications, how that may have a chilling effect on how many more of us then come through the application and admissions process. So we have to deliberately care for those coming next.
I agree. Yvette, you want to chime in?
I just wanted to chime in on the subject of humor. I have to tell you, I think that is a superpower. The likability factor of people isn't out, but like what Kimberly said, I had so many moments in my career where people, did things that I was just like, you got to be kidding. And my big joke, I had a friend, and she hates when I quote this, but I remember she was like, he's a dinosaur. And I remember thinking, because I had moved to Texas from Florida, and there's oil in Texas a lot, and you put them in the Suburbans and then the big trucks, and I would tease and I would say, you're being a dinosaur. You know what happened to those dinosaurs? They end up in our trucks and our whatever. And it became a thing. That and bless your heart, which is a wonderful phrase for you're an idiot in some way. But I found that humor, with clients, with peers, was a you got to be kidding kind of situation. And, from being asked to make coffee that I had never made in my entire life and say, look, I don't make coffee, but maybe you can make coffee with me. I'd like to see how it tastes because I go buy it. It was always like a humor, and it was never. And some people say, look, that's not the way to change behavior. Sometimes you have to call the question. And sometimes there is behavior that is so ridiculous that you have to say, seriously? We're just going to pretend that never happened. We're just going to pretend like you didn't tell me that a woman can't be on the pleading, because imagine if I didn't say, and I would say whatever their religion wasn't on the pleading. I know you didn't mean that, and I know you don't want your daughter to know that. I know you don't want your mother to know that. And so let's just behave. Let's all pretend like that didn't happen. And so I want to give us back for humor. And because if you assume positive intent, and that sometimes people are just doing dumb things and using a wrong word or having a teachable moment, and that they want to do the right thing, you get them in a better position than they are. And so I have found that, whether it's a man or woman, the people that have made it to leadership or being successful, that is part of their superpower generally, because they can deflect that way. The second thing about fashion, I couldn't agree more. The more powerful, the less the people walk in, right? Look at some of these tech billionaires. They come in and you're like, seriously? But there is something about that too, in terms of the intersectionality of clothing and fashion, and where people put you in a category depending on who you are. And that's part of the cultural sensitivities of, that I saw, for example, of how the Hispanic lawyer would dress or behave. That was very different depending on what part of the country you were in the US. And so that's where I spend sometimes a lot of time mentoring people in unusual situations, of calling them before and saying, hey, and it could be at my kid's school. It could be, the first generation lawyers, their kids that had never gone to a private school. Their kids would have the rolling bags. Well, you couldn't have a rolling bag in an all boys school for a host of reasons. And so I would call them and say, hey, this is a thing you don't do, and you don't wear this type of clothes. And it's just to help them, right? Make sure, not assimilate, but be in a situation where they could be successful and not be bullied sometimes. And so I think all of that, when you're trying to see cultural differences, like I always was going around and talking to people and saying, so what is the dress code for this, or what do you do? Because it was very different in my culture than in a business environment or in a boardroom. The more senior I get, and when you have the title and whatever, if you want to call it power with a low P, you have a lot more room for that, right? You have a lot more room for doing that. I never bought into that you had to be the same as everybody else. I never bought into that, but also you don't want things to detract from your success.
So Heather, did you want to weigh in before we go to the next question? I want to make one remark that I heard from Kim. She said, if you wear a nose ring, you might not want to be a general counsel. I don't know. I will tell you that we always make assumptions, and society does move. I would have said that about dreadlocks.
Yeah.
Just pause and think about it a minute. And now you have many lawyers who have dreadlocks. I'm just making an observation. Okay, Heather, go ahead.
Well put, Michele. I was kidding, by the way, but
I wanted to share your question really hit me, which was, if you were, back in the day, would you have done things differently? And I try pretty hard not to hold myself to standards that I hold myself to now for when I was going through a very different cultural time. When I share stories of sexual harassment or microaggressions or what have you with my husband, he'll be like, why didn't you throw a drink in his face? And those types of, why didn't you stomp out of there? And, that type of thing. And it's like, the times were very different. And women back in the day, I was at the largest law firm in the world at the time. I was at Skadden. I was the first lawyer outside the United States. We had 22 foreign offices. I was the first lawyer outside the United States to have a baby. I was simultaneously the highest billing associate at the firm for 2 years running, while pregnant, traveling, doing deals in 14 different countries. Many of those countries were, as some of the stories that really resonated, we're not used to having women unless they were coming around with the coffee carts, right? So it was very challenging, but we were given, and this isn't a Skadden thing because I'm a huge fan of the firm, I use them every day, but times were different, and women were made to feel that they were lucky to just have a seat at the table. So don't be too noisy, don't be too needy, be grateful for having, for having a seat at the table. And so I learned, the way Yvette was saying she used humor, I learned to kind of enjoy people underestimating me, right? I used to just watch their faces when I would come in and I'd sit down, and they would assume that I was, the one that was taking the notes or bringing the coffee or what have you, right? And when it became obvious that I was actually there to, to Kim's point, to close the deal or what have you, I found it fun to kind of watch the realization wash over their face, and for them to kind of, mentally go back, recognize the microaggressions that they had or the assumptions that they had, and watching them come to their own realizations. So I chose to make a game of it, because other than that, I think I might just cry.
Yeah, we don't want crying going on here. So,
But if you
Angelique,
cry, it's
what
okay.
stereotype? Well, but you know what? That's another thing if we talk about gender, but then we get distracted, and I have a few more questions I want to handle. So, what stereotypes most trouble you when you look at race, ethnicity, culture? Which ones do you think are most debilitating when you talk about those stereotypes, especially from your point of view? Do people think you're not competent, for example, because you got there through affirmative action or whatever? Angelique?
Oh, I wasn't sure if you
I was
were asking
tossing,
me. Okay.
yeah, I
So,
was tossing that
yeah. So,
question to you.
okay. I think for Native women in
Want me to repeat
general,
it?
there's a lot of stereotypes about just frozen in time, people not recognizing that we're still here, that we are members of tribal governments, that we're not competent, that, it's sort of like introduction 101 and really having to explain yourself. And that leads to all these stereotypes about visibility, that we do belong in the legal profession, that we can be lawyers and judges. We haven't seen that yet on the U.S. Supreme Court. We haven't even seen that on a federal circuit court yet, but we do have 3 tribally enrolled women on the federal district courts. There's just so much right now where we're the first. And so having that trailblazing, you have to be the first, it means that we have to really deal with lots of stereotypes and lots of misinformation and lots of unknowns about who we are. And, the whole the Land O'Lakes butter image that, gets used still to this day harms us being seen as lawyers, judges, competent women. And I will say, many of us come from matrilineal societies where we did have leadership positions before all the devastation that happened in the 1800s. So it's sort of an upside down, topsy-turvy reality for us to be bicultural and navigate these systems and assert who we are and explain who we are often.
So I just want, you know what I want to do? I want to go back to some words that we've been referencing throughout the call for the last hour almost, and that has to do with sponsors, mentors, allies, coaches. So let me just level set in how I think about that. An ally is someone who works with you to do something that you couldn't accomplish necessarily on your own. That you found your common ground, and that individual or institution is going to back you or run front door depending on what you work out mutually. When I think of sponsors, those are people who speak for you or about you when you're not in the room many times. So they're going to pitch you, they're going to vouch for you, they're going to put their political capital on the line for you. When I think about mentors, those are people that you're meeting with privately and you're speaking with one another, working out issues, trying to figure out the best strategy, whether you're dodging the hard questions or the hard work. And when I think of what I call coaches, they speak to you. So coaches speak to you, mentors speak with you, allies plan how you're going to navigate something, and you work collaboratively. So I don't think those terms or labels are interchangeable. They can overlap sometimes, but they are distinct. The other thing that I wanted to mention, and this is really, really hard, there's a book called The Person You Mean to Be by Professor Dolly Chugh. And I think we as minorities, that is the women of color, frequently find when we're looking for allies, as in a person like Heather, what you want to avoid is someone who's sympathetic for you. Oh, I feel so sorry for you. No, I don't want you to feel sorry for me. I want you to help me. I don't want you to save me. I want you to plan with me what we can do. I don't want you to typecast me. Well, you can only aspire to go this high. And I do not want you to tolerate me. So those are traps that we frequently can find people who are trying to help us falling in. So no sympathy, no saving, no tolerating, no typecasting. See me as an individual. So let me move on to a question that I wanted all of you to tackle. Do you have women's initiatives in your space? And there have been criticisms about women's initiatives saying you're balkanizing, all the women get together. And does that exclude white men or men, period? If you're saying this collective of people that have at least gender in common in some fashion are going to kind of go off on their own and have some discussions. Is that resented where you are? How have you navigated if you've said, yeah, women's initiative makes sense? Who wants to tackle that first? I'm going to call on Heather. Okay, Kim, you can go, darling. Go right ahead.
I will go first. Yes, my company has a women's initiative, and I have been involved in the women's initiatives in all the companies I've ever worked at, and it's something I do with pride. Does it include women of color? Absolutely. We've got women of color in leadership and across the organization. In terms of sponsorship, one thing I'm really proud of is the executive sponsor of our women's initiative is a man. Even though we have multiple women on the executive team, because it was important, not only because the executives were interested, but it allows us to show the organization that allyship and sponsorship is a good thing. It is not just something that we talk about. And so those are some of the key things I wanted to make sure that people at least heard. And I'm, again, work for a company that's got a really strong manufacturing footprint. We're not at the end of our journey, but it is something important. And it is something that we try as an organization to spread across the group so that people can feel comfortable, man, woman, race, gender, ability, that they can be involved. So I'd say a significant percentage of our women's group is made up of folks who are not women. So it's just a way to say, how do we develop talent across the board?
Do others? What about you, Yvette? Do you have a women's initiative at the firm?
We've had affinity groups and different law firms that I've been in, and also my clients that do it. In our particular firm, we are focused on mentoring, retaining, retention. We have programs that, regardless of gender, everybody participates in terms of building leadership skills and success skills. But we have a particular emphasis, for example, in our Built to Succeed program on scholarships that are focused on leaders of different organizations within the school and first generation individuals. On the women's side, what we've done is we invite everybody to everything. So yesterday we had, as part of Sidley Women, a trailblazing speaker sponsored by Sidley Women. Condoleezza Rice spoke, and everybody went. And I got emails from some of the men that participated in that, grateful that they were invited. We had an associate that was a male saying, these words that I got, I'm going to look into, and I put them in my computer. There are some things that by definition, the nature of them, it ends up being that only the women come, even though we invite everybody. But my male counterparts are always grateful when we're entertaining their clients and bringing in business. So again, when we focus on business, when we focus on everybody being successful, when we focus on the cost of attrition of men and women in the organization, and focusing on how we can be more successful in things that may be unique to women, like having a child and the physical impact of that sometimes to some people. Anything that we can do that focuses on retention and recruiting the best is the focus of it. With that said, and one of the comments that was asked, have you seen challenges on it? Absolutely. There are people that have said, oh, I'm a white cis male and I no longer have a place in an organization or in a school. By the way, they taught me what the word cis was. I had to look it up. I said, I don't know that I can discriminate since I don't even know what the word is, but I'll find it. And then I figured out what they were telling me at the time.
Okay, so
but,
that's willful knowledge, right? You figured it out.
Right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was like, wow, what is it what is this thing that I'm being accused of that I don't know? And then, I looked it up. I said, no, I'm not that, but that's okay. But I'm glad you educated me. But, this was a person that was not performing and was not being successful. And, we've seen throughout history that when some people that have used to be successful were just successful, perhaps in their mediocrity, then they want to blame it on others. And my father-in-law, who has now passed away, a wonderful man, and he had gone to Harvard Business School. And he had gone back when they had the GI Bill. And also when you saw the picture of him in business school, it was all men, all white men. And I had a discussion with him one day where I said to him, wow, that's impressive. You went to this Ivy League school. And he looked at me and he said, Yvette, when you discriminate against women, Jews, minorities, he went through the whole thing. You can be incredibly mediocre and have gone to Harvard Business School and graduated. And so it was a very telling moment for me because he was funny and he acknowledged that he could have never competed with people like me. But, that it was an interesting observation because if you were part of a group, that was just part of what you got. That transition is not going to be easy, right? And so we shouldn't expect it to be easy. We shouldn't expect it that people are going to say, oh, sure, take my spot. And so I always like to openly acknowledge that and say, I know you feel, got to work harder. And I tell my kids that, when my kids would come in from school and say, I got the best grade of this group of people in math, and I would say, oh, congratulations, I guess, good for you that you're in that category, And so I would always say, be careful for that first gen person like me that's just going to work 24/7 because this is my shot out of poverty. And I think it's to have those discussions, be open about it. When I have seen discrimination and somebody has wanted me to fail, and I've seen it where people have said, and I have said, why do you want me to fail? Aren't I the American story? Aren't I the dream? Why won't you want me to win? Why are you making this so difficult? I've called the question and they catch themselves. And I've had that in every leadership role that I've had because it is a competition, especially as you get higher up.
It is. So Yvette, let me interrupt you. I know you have a lot more to say, but we are coming up on the end of the actual panel, and I don't know if there are questions. And I'm going to ask the operator because I can't see all the questions. If you could pick a few that we could try to tackle in the next 15 minutes or so that we have with Kim, Yvette, Angelique, Heather, Kim. I already mentioned Kim. So if there are questions that you think we haven't touched upon. One that I can see is this idea of how can a white male make a difference in establishing trust. How do you guys think about that? Because I think about allies. That's exactly what I think about when I think about how white males can help women of color in general get to where they want to be. I think of them as allies. And if they're not, if they're, putting roadblocks up, I'm curious whether you would subscribe to that philosophy. Angelique?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Anyone can be an ally. It just takes, that positive intention that I know people have talked about today, establishing and earning trust and showing up willing to learn. And doing some background, we don't have to carry the whole burden of educating everybody. People do have the ability to deliberately educate themselves, learn more, and then bring these conversations up, not necessarily in a provocative way, but in a way where you actually want to hear what the other person has to say and want to share perspectives. And I know from the report here that this talk isn't cheap. I mean, that's one of the things that it talks about is commit to engaging in dialogue and be comfortable with a little bit of discomfort. That's how we learn. Yep. That's how we engage. And absolutely anyone from any background can do that.
One of the other things that I'm saying, go ahead.
One of the other things that we've sort of touched on a little bit is how are experiences for women of color in the workplace different? And one of the things I want to talk a little bit about is safety. And that's where allies and mentors and sponsors can come in as well. Having safety in spaces to speak and raise points, because often we've mentioned this, it's rare for us to be at the table. And so we're often the trailblazers. And we have to have the courage to speak up often when we hear conversation going off track or when we have something that we want to offer. And so creating that space and holding that space and acknowledging when a woman makes a comment. I don't know how many times I've been in a room where I've said something, a few minutes later, a man says the same thing or paraphrases me and gets the credit. So we have to be deliberate about listening and about raising up the women in the room.
I would say
I agree with
that
you.
comment that you just made is, Angelique, it's almost like a weekly Heather shaking her head. So I have this joke that I do that kind of makes people cringe so they don't do it anymore. Whenever I come up with an idea or somebody else, whether it's a woman or a man, and they do that, and then they say, like he said, the next time I say something, I go, hey, and I pick whoever it was that they picked. I said, can you please share this idea to the group? I just want to make sure that the right person gets, and it's like a cute thing and I've done it and in groups that I run, and I'll be like, can you be my official ventriloquist? I'm like, imagine this, and then it stops them. It never happens again. A practice pointer, but it is almost weekly that I will be in a group that I am leading a team or that something, and that somebody will acknowledge another person that usually it's a woman that's come up with an idea. And so, for many years I didn't call the question, and now I do. Now I actually say, so if it's Heather that they called, I'll say, hey, Heather, can you tell the group this? That way we'll save ourselves 2 times. And they'll be like, and then it never happens. So then my counterparts who have been men in the room don't do it. They're like, hey, she was the one that came up with the idea. They start acknowledging because they don't want to be called. It's crazy.
One thing I've done, because I think all of us have experienced that, is I'll say, oh, you're building on what Yvette already mentioned earlier. So what are you adding?
That's a very nice
way
way
to
do it,
say,
Michele.
You're not taking. Yep, there's a way you're not taking all the credit, buddy. So I'm going to see if there are other questions that you think, oh, someone is asking, and this is your phrase or your word, Yvette. What do you mean by unicorn in this context? You called yourself a
Angelique,
unicorn.
I think
They said
you might have used the word unicorn too, but or somebody else did. I saw somebody else but the bottom line is.
But I'm tagging you to answer it.
Maybe it was you, Michele, that just used it. But I think in this context is we don't want to be unicorns because they don't exist. And so in the in the tech world, they call unicorn something very special, and it was more in that context of like something that you're doing that's new and different. So.
Okay. So what do others think? I know that Yvette had used it, or maybe I used it. Do others think that that's not a good way to describe when our differences? Because as Yvette said, well, unicorns don't exist. They're fictional. Would you stay away from that, or just say, I have differences that add value?
I don't want to be a unicorn. I don't think anybody should aim for being a fictional animal. But there is Heather's laughing. But I do think that in the business, in the industry, it does have a phrase about unicorn businesses and things like that. And it is when you're doing something new and different. So I think in that context of being new and different and adding value that's different, that's a good word.
Okay.
So Michele, one thing I do want to say before we completely wrap up is well-being and mental health are so important. It can be very exhausting to have to assert yourself and be on all the time, and make sure you have your space, and make sure that you walk in the room. And as women of color, I think one thing that we always do is we scan who's here. And that adds to our sense of, is this a safe space, or what kind of space am I in? What am I going to have to do here? And that does take a lot more energy than walking in and knowing you're automatically going to be, one of the normal, whatever that is for that organization, people in the room, and you can just mingle and do whatever. When we're absent, you can know, right? If we're not there, we're not there when there's few of us. So there's a lot more, I think, pressure on us, even when we're silent, even when we're not there, even when we're walking into an organization that chose us. And I think mental health and taking care of yourself, and I'm with the millennials and Gen Z. We need mental health days. We need to take self-care. We need well-being. And I appreciate them bringing that more into focus for all of us.
Yeah, I agree with you. I've got some areas that I talk about when you say, how do you succeed? I talk about taking risks, taking credit, taking a hand, taking a stand, and taking care. And taking care is more than just saying, I'm healthy. It's what are you doing financially, spiritually, physically? All of it. And I think too many of us just try to plow through and say, you know what? It's just the way the world is. I'm not going to try to change it. And I'm glad that many of the people on this call have been willing to change it. So is there any other question you think I should tackle? Because again, I can't see all of them. Don't ask me why.
And Michele,
Kim.
This is Kim. There was one question. There was a question about the nose ring comment and talking about affecting change. If you wouldn't mind, I'm going to go there. I don't wear,
go ahead.
I'm going to bring it. I always wear jeans when I go to Silicon Valley. I always wear suits when I'm in finance. I would tell folks to pick your battles. If that's super important to you, the nose ring or how you present, go for it. But there may be other ways you want to use your power or your voice. And that's what I meant with the nose ring comment. So I didn't want it to be seen as a criticism, but more as a way of people thinking about what's important. And I'm very glad that we can now have dreadlocks as opposed to having relaxed hair. And that is a comment for women of color, because we all know what I'm talking about. But thank you for letting me address that point, and thank you for the person who asked it.
No, I'm glad, Kim. I'm glad you corrected it so it didn't sound like you were being so conservative and risk adverse that you would never consider a nose ring. But attitudes change over time. That's also what all of us recognize, especially with all the different generations in the workforce right now, which has been referenced, Gen Z, Gen X, millennials, you name it. They all see through a different lens. They just do.
And I'm excited
so are there
because
any
they're
other
changing the profession for the better. I truly believe they're changing the profession for the better.
Agreed.
So
Yes.
Operator, are there any questions you think I'm overlooking?
Yes, there was a follow-up right behind that one that said, but should people have to change who they are for acceptance? Isn't that part of the problem?
I think
Who wants to tackle that one, Heather? Go ahead, Kim.
Heather, please.
Kim, were you going to take it?
I was just going to echo what Kim had just said, which is, it depends on what is most important to you. Like, you have to recognize that how you present yourself is going to be the first thing that people notice. So that's just how the brain works. They're going to make assessments. And if that's how you want to be initially perceived, then have at it. That's great. If you want people to be focused on your nose ring or your hair or the length of your skirt or your purple nail polish, whatever the case may be, your tattoo, then own it. Just recognize that sometimes people will be focused on the appearance before they're going to be focused on the substance of what you're saying. So I think it's just it's just self-expression. And I don't think I love the fact that I think there's a long way to go, but I love the fact that there is, that there are laws coming into place that, require people to be able to come with their full authentic selves. I love that. I think it goes to the entire diversity of perspectives and culture. But just recognize that people will notice. And that's fine if that's what you want. But if you want to be, if you don't want people to notice that, then don't get a tattoo on your cheek or what have you.
I want to
Angelique,
just
go
jump in
ahead.
real quick, Michelle, and kind of say, I do think that we are in a time in the United States where there are a lot of different voices around who women are and what women should be and do, and that it is really in all of our best interest to build these collaborations and know each other and support each other, because there are a lot of things happening out in this world where we're part of the intelligentsia, we're the lawyers, we're the legal professionals, we're the law professors, we're the judges. We are in a position where we can articulate our thoughts about who we are as women, and we owe it to each other to do that, to be on the forefront of these issues. Because if we don't, there are other people that are making decisions about where we belong and what we should be doing. And so I commend the ABA for doing this study, for doing this panel, for bringing in a leader like Michele to moderate, because we absolutely do need to be visible and articulate at this moment in time as women.
Here, here.
Amen.
Okay, so you have everybody, amen, and Angelique. So is there any other question that's burning that we can touch upon in the next minute and a half or so?
Yes, you have one question that says, what do you do in response to people calling into question your organization celebrating women and their achievements?
So I'm going to ask Heather to start that one, you think?
Or
maybe your organization doesn't call into question. I don't know.
No. Well, I mean, I think all corporations are, getting some anti-wokeness backlash. We're publishing our 100-page sustainability report tomorrow, and it touts all of the things we are doing with regard to equity, inclusion, carbon, net zero, all of our ESG focus. And we do get that backlash, and our response is we're doing the right thing. Way back an hour ago when we were talking about it's the right thing to do, and it's the right thing for business. And we tout, accomplishments of women. We tout the accomplishments of non-women. We tout the accomplishments of people who have accomplishments. So I think it's about standing firm to your corporate values. And I'm just lucky that my corporation's values mirror my own personal values.
One thing I'll mention, and I want to end with a quote that I think is pretty powerful, but there was a gentleman who said, at first they degrade you, humiliate you, and marginalize you, and then they build monuments to you. And so the question is, what do you do when they're humiliating you, degrading you until you get to the monument? It's a question just to think about, because sometimes you're plowing the ground for other people who are going to reap the rewards, and maybe you don't reap them. So the quote that I really like, because it goes back to what I think this panel is all about, which is by a 13th century poet. It says, out beyond the ideas of right doing and wrongdoing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. So I want to thank our panelists, Heather, Yvette, Angelique, Kim. Even though we couldn't see you, we definitely heard you. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, your questions, and for having the courage to tackle something that isn't necessarily an issue that people gravitate toward. So I know that you should stay on the line for your directions about the CLE, and the operator will handle that. But thank you so much for joining this afternoon. And again, thank you to the panel.
Thank you, Michele.
Thank you, Michele.
Maybe.
And we still have 2 minutes to fill. So Angelique, there's a question for you. You can answer it.
2 minutes.
Yeah, yes. And Angelique, how have you contributed to recruiting Native students to law schools?
Oh, I'm busy doing that a lot. I have online recruitment sessions. I speak on panels like this. I teach at the Pre-Law Summer Institute in Albuquerque for American Indians and Alaska Natives. So that is very meaningful to me. And so that is something I am on the regular doing day in and day out. We even had a billboard up in the Twin Cities that said, earn your law degree. And I put it out on my social media. If you're looking for your sign, here it is.
Someone just made a remark, and Kim, you may love this. It wasn't that we were talking about nose rings and dreadlocks, obviously. And one of the questions was, well, what about the time when women couldn't wear pants to court?
I got lots of
Okay,
stories
I'm not
about
going to
my
harken
friends.
back.
Yes, I got lots of stories from my friends that were litigators on what they said to judges, but that's for another day and not on this panel.
That's for another panel. We can talk about fashion another time. So I think if I tell the operator we're at 4:32, we've accomplished our goal. Now we can close. Again, thank you everyone for attending, and thank you to the panel. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
And I do want to thank our panel and the sentiment of all of your observers that this has been a wonderful presentation. And so, thank you very much for attending today. On behalf of the American Bar Association and the ABA Commission on Women in the Profession and Civil Rights and Social Justice Section, thank you for participating in this program. To learn more about the sponsors, visit the ABA website at americanbar.org. Thank you, and please click on the evaluation link. We value your feedback.